So today we're hearing one of the more unconventional Christmas stories. Not the one about angels singing or shepherds coming to the manger and worshiping the baby Jesus, but the one about Herod giving the order to kill all of the baby boys in and around Bethlehem in an attempt to murder Jesus. How did we go so quickly from Christmas joy to crying? The reality is our lives are messy and they are not always filled with joy and singing. So can the Christmas story offer us hope in these moments? Welcome to Sermons for a Critical Faith, a ministry of First Presbyterian Church in Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm Pastor Sue Collar. We ask questions here, and we're not afraid to tackle stories that don't feel good and that are difficult to hear. This is one of those stories today. We tackle them because as hard as they are to hear, we're living them in our own lives and in our own world today. Maybe you're dealing with a loss that just doesn't make sense. Maybe you're dealing with someone who's out to get you. And how can we forget the constant flow of news from Ukraine and the cries of mothers crying for their children lost in war? We all face hard times and crisis and heartbreaking losses. Where is God in these moments? Where was God when Herod ordered the killing, the murder of all of those children? We're happy to have as our guest preacher today, the Reverend Raymond Meester, and he's going to walk through this with us and help us find hope in this story.
After they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child and destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, or according to the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went into the land of Israel. But when he had heard that Archelaus was ruling Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. Thanks be to God.
I apologize for having to take drinks of water while I'm preaching, but I have a really bad dry mouth, and I might not be able to finish the sermon. Some of you would probably give my mouth some other adjectives, but when I was serving my first church after I was ordained, it was in a small town in southwest Kansas, Coldwater, Kansas. It was a county seat, but there were less than 1,000 people in that town. And to let you know how small it was, one morning I walked to the post office to get my mail, and there was a notice that I needed to renew my license plate. So I walked to the courthouse, and I got number 1. And if you don't believe me, it's hanging in the garage. But while I lived in that town, the county supervisors were in charge of the ambulance service. It was a county-wide service. And they asked about 6 of us if we'd be willing to take the training to be EMTs. They were running short in volunteers, and they said they would pay for it. So I took them up on that, took the training, became certified. And a little bit later, I got a call in the middle of the night that we needed to make a run to Wichita for a newborn baby. So I quickly got into my clothes, rushed to the ambulance barn, waited for the other person, and we went to the hospital to pick up the newborn baby. Now, I always had the habit of asking the doctor, we just had one doctor in that town, how bad the situation was to know whether or not we really needed to go fast or whether we could just kind of keep with the speed limit. And his response to me was, the hell with, and then he mentioned the name of a little town between us and Wichita that we would have to go through. And I knew exactly what he meant. First of all, I never heard this doctor swear. It was the only time I ever heard him swear, so that clued me. And then the reason he mentioned this small town was this town would not allow emergency vehicles to exceed the speed limit going through that town. Now, I mentioned that I rushed to get to the ambulance barn. I rushed because the tradition was that whoever got to the ambulance first got to drive. I did not want to have to care for a child. To me, a child shouldn't be sick, shouldn't be hurting, shouldn't be dying. Believe me, the 3 blocks and the 4 turns that were from my house to that ambulance barn, I learned how fast I could go and still negotiate the corners. I had a difficult time with whenever we had a call for a child. Some of you may know that our daughter is a chaplain at Norton Children's Hospital in Louisville, Kentucky. She's a chaplain in their NICU, their neonatal intensive care unit. It's a level 4, which is the sickest of the infants, and they have a capacity for about 100 babies. I couldn't do that job. Children should not be sick, hurting, dying. And so I think a lot of you probably will agree with me that this passage from Matthew is rather difficult, rather troubling. The situation causes Rachel to be weeping for her children, as the passage says. It was a quote from Jeremiah. Rachel was a matriarch in the Old Testament. This phrase, Rachel weeping for her children, was really kind of a catch-all phrase for all mothers who wept for their children. Now, we all know the story about the Magi, the wise men, who followed the star in search of the new king that was born. And when they got to Jerusalem, they asked where this newborn king was, and word got to Herod that these magi were in town looking for a newborn king. Now, most kings do not like to have a challenge to the throne. And Herod was rather despicable. He even killed his own wife and son because he thought that they were challenging him to the throne. Herod had a real lust for authority and power. So he calls the Magi in, and he tells them, when you find the newborn king, come and tell me where the child is so that I too may pay homage. Well, liar, liar, pants on fire. We know that that's not what he wanted to do. He wanted to do this child in. But the Magi were warned not to go back to Herod, to leave on a different route. And when Herod finally realizes that he's been tricked, he orders the slaughter of all the children who were 2 years old or younger around Bethlehem. And so we read that there was wailing and loud lamentation. and mothers who refuse to be consoled, and Rachel weeping for her children. And so we have quickly gone from singing, hearing joy to the world, to hearing Rachel weeping for her children. Quite a departure from this festive season of Christmas. And by the way, we are still in the season of Christmas. Don't let the retailers fool you. Christmas doesn't start until Christmas Day, but I'm a liturgical nerd. But this story of the killing of the children indeed is a severe jolt in this festive season of Christmas. We perhaps partied with friends and family. We've gone to worship on Christmas Eve, singing our cherished Christmas carols. We've gathered together as families. Perhaps this is the only time of the year the whole family gathers together. We've enjoyed treats and good meals. So why do we go from hearing joy to the world to hearing Rachel weeping for her children? I can think that some of you are probably going to tell Sue, don't ever let him preach again. He preaches about all these terrible subjects. But did God will this massacre? Could not God have stopped Herod from killing these children? It's all a question of what we refer to as theodicy. Theodicy deals with the relationship of God and evil. If God is all good, if God is all powerful, if God is in control, then why is there evil? Why do bad things happen? The book of Job is all about this theodicy. You may know the story about Job, who was a righteous man, and yet he lost all of his wealth. His children were killed. He suffered boils all over his body. And for about 40 chapters, he and his friends are having this discussion, this dialogue about theodicy. Even to the point of some of his friends saying to him, you must have sinned, and that's why God did this to you. But we aren't given an answer. In fact, in the end, God declares to Job, more or less, who do you think you are? You're a mortal. Do you think you're God to know the mystery of God? We don't know this mystery, and so there is no answer. But before I go on, the Reverend Dr. Thomas Long makes an interesting observation about our passage. Now, Matthew was written to a congregation of people that had a Jewish heritage. You got to remember that the very early Christians were Jews, and we think that Matthew wrote this gospel to make a connection between Jesus and their Jewish heritage. And about 10 times in the Gospel of Matthew, we read something that goes like this. This was done in order to fulfill what had been spoken by the prophet. Or this happened to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. But Dr. Long points out that concerning the massacre, Matthew words it a bit differently. It's subtle. Here Matthew said, then what had been spoken to the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. So instead of saying this was done in order to fulfill or this happened to fulfill, he quotes Jeremiah, and it pretty well just says, well, it just happened. Long claims that this subtle change is significant, for by doing so, Matthew stops short of claiming that it was God's will. But still, we have no explanation of why. So we may not know why, but perhaps there's a reason why Matthew at least included this story, why Matthew interrupts our festive season was such a jolt. We live in a world in which Rachel continues to weep for her children. Putin, another man who evidently lusts for authority and power, in his invasion of Ukraine, it's killed thousands of innocent people, civilians. It's been estimated that at least 400 children have been killed, and many believe that that's an undercount. Rachel continues to weep for our children in gun violence in our own nation. Since Sandy Hook about a decade ago, there have been 22 school shootings that have killed 69 children. But that's nothing. It's a small percentage of all the children that are killed by gun violence in our country. Over a recent 5-year period, we've averaged 1,839 children killed by gun violence every year. Those between the ages of 1 and 17. That's 5 a day. And in 2020, gun violence was the leading cause of death for children and youth between 1 and 19. Rachel continues to weep for our children. And it's because Rachel continues to weep that Matthew probably included this passage. Because Christmas, we all know, is about God coming to be with us. One of the titles for Jesus is Immanuel, and we hear that word a lot during Advent and Christmas. There's even that Advent hymn, O come, Immanuel. Immanuel. God is with us. That is God's response to the violence and the troubles. The forces that oppose God's way in our world are strong indeed. However, they cannot destroy God's ability to be with us, to save us, to redeem us. There is no evil, no violence in its most catastrophic form, no evil that is as merciless as killing innocent children that can destroy God's ability to save us. Immanuel, God is with us. And that is our hope. Reverend Dr. Luke Powery, who teaches at Duke Divinity School, said, if a preacher avoids dealing with death, he or she will not be able to preach Christian hope in any meaningful way. And he adds that many churches are left with sermons that are fundamentally hopeless because of the denial of death in general. Matthew included this story to remind us that we cannot deny that there is violence and death. And the gospel cannot be relevant if we ignore the violence and the grief and the weeping. It's kind of like my home state of Iowa, where now it's illegal for the teachers in the schools to teach any kind of systemic racism. We can't deal with the racism if we choose to ignore the racism. In the same way, we can't deal with death if we ignore its reality. The gospel cannot be relevant if we ignore the violence and the troubles and the grief. And Matthew's inclusion of this story is a call for all of us who observe the birth of this Christ child to have hope. This annual celebration of Christmas is a call for us to renew our hope. So yes, We hear Rachel weeping for her children, but also hear the words of that hymn, Joy to the World, the first few phrases. Joy to the world, the Lord is come. God is with us. Glory to God in the highest, and peace to God's people on earth. Amen.
Thanks for joining us at First Presbyterian Church, where faith is nurtured, curiosity encouraged, diversity welcomed, and all are loved. Find out more about us at fpclincoln.org.